Okay. All right. While Benjamin gets set up here, I just want to introduce him quickly and just say thanks for everybody attending. This is CMS Philly 2020. We're doing a virtual conference of Drupal, WordPress, and other CMS platforms. This is the 11 o'clock session in the community track. And with us today, we have Benjamin from Agaric, and he is going to be taking us through scaling community, a discussion and decision making. Just a couple of reminders for everybody. If you can hold your questions until the end, you can certainly post them into chat. There's a little click icon, question mark icon. You can pose a question to be answered at the end of the session. At the end of the session, Ben, if you wish, you can unmute everyone and they can share their feedback and thoughts and questions. That'll be recorded along with the presentation. If there's any materials you want us to provide, those will be shared here in chat and online after the session's complete. So you can always watch this recording on cmsphilly.org or on several other YouTube channels. We'll have this posted. And last but not least, hopefully you saw the raffle we just did earlier. And we'll also have some additional sessions. Just keep an eye out in the Slack channels for notifications around that. We'll be doing another raffle later. And we have a virtual happy hour at the end of the day at 4 o'clock after the last session. You can join me for that as well. All right, Benjamin, if you're ready, I will turn it over to you.
I'm ready, thank you. All right, thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, please do use the chat, and moderators or anyone who can, please raise to my attention. I normally happy with being interrupted at any point during the session, but I guess we've got a lot to cover and starting a little bit late, so yeah, I'm gonna hold till the end. Talking about scaling community communication and decision making, and yeah. And my name is Ben Melançon. You can find me at mlncn on Drupal.org, Twitter, social.coop, and just about anywhere else online. And I am with a web development collective, worker-owned cooperative named Agaric. How do we currently make democratic decisions? This image of people being hit over the head with sticks by police officers is sort of meant to be funny, but is also pretty close to the truth. If you're trying to have an impact on important decisions in your life, there's a good chance that yeah, your route to having an influence involves actual like civil disobedience and conflict if you're actually going to get a change. And for the most part, we don't see that, and we don't see any changes. So I will disclose my biases straight up. I feel like we need to be working towards the most power possible to all people over our own lives. And this is the, try to be concrete when we're talking about justice and liberty, which I am very much for, but it's hard to be clear you're talking about the same thing, because people have made careers trying to define liberty as the right of rich people to do whatever they want with their property, and having to make ridiculous arguments like someone stuck in a hole is just as free as a person not in that pit to do so. But trying to redefine liberty as having nothing to do with something that we can grasp, as in our freedom to do things. So most power possible to all people over our own lives has the implication that justice and liberty require a level of equality in them. So a lot of people here coming to CMS, affiliate CMS, are coming from open source communities, some of which define their way of doing things as opposed to the outside world, which can be democracy or plutocracy, ruled by the rich, or anything in between, as meritocracy. And that would be great, ruled by those with merit, but unfortunately it's a myth. So in the particular open source context, it means rule by those who have the most time, rule by people who have the most access to certain resources, frequently income, and more than that, like by sort of putting out a claim that the rule, that whoever's making decisions is doing so because of merit, it becomes another form of unexamined privilege and undefined sort of social control, undefined group dynamics. And there's some really good, and at the end I linked to resources with a lot of great writing about everything I'm talking about. But in meritocracy in particular, the word itself comes from a political satire, and it was never meant to be something we should aspire to. It was a warning about how we rationalize what we believe we've earned. And if that sentence doesn't seem applicable to the tech industry and our cyclical discussions about sexism, racism, and sometimes we even talk about classism, then definitely should read the entire blog post. You keep using that word at Garin.com. So I think I'll return to sort of the meritocracy idea in a bit, but I will note that in the community I'm mostly from, Drupal, we have at least dropped use of that term in our own self-identity for the most part, in place of do-ocracy, which is, it's a volunteer project. The people who go and do things are the ones who ultimately make decisions. But that still doesn't really get to structural power that can still exist even in a volunteer project. So all of this is getting at the fact that, no matter what we do, people are a problem. And I'm saying that better communication, decision-making structures can be part of the solution, and coming at it from a very pro-democracy, power to the people direction. But I think it's important to note that any of the problems we run into are also coming from us. But the good news is that the ways that people are problematic tend to be consistent, and there's all sorts of stuff we can do to make ourselves better individually and collectively. And so this talk on decision-making and more broadly governance and on communication still touches on a tiny subset of the things that we can change. But it's but better systems can make for better people is the basic point. One of the biases that people have is that we don't care about decision-making processes until there's something we don't like. So we're not likely to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make the meta processes in our communities and open source and otherwise better. But when we really need to do something, we have to get on that. So knowledge is not power, despite the common saying. Miriam Keba, Prison Culture on Twitter, is highly knowledgeable on the subject as a longtime organizer, herself focusing on ending violence, dismantling the prison industrial complex, practicing transformative justice, and supporting youth leadership development. But power is organization. What we need to make change in every case is to organize. So turning back to open source world for a moment, free software world, half of all open source free software projects have only one maintainer, one committer, forget maintainer, one committer. And these projects don't have to worry about scaling community communication and decision-making. And if we were to look at it for pieces of our projects like WordPress plugins or Drupal modules and other repositories around our various CMS worlds, we likely see very similar, even though you know, most of the content management systems we're working with are themselves like amazing paragons of community coordination, in that they are some of the very few projects that have hundreds and thousands of contributors. But I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, one way of scaling decision making is to spread it out like that. So the fact that you don't need to go through you know, the WordPress committee or the Drupal committee in order to contribute to the project. You just create your own plugin, theme, module, you know, piece of thing, or you fork the project entirely and do your thing, or you just start something new using pieces of technology that already exists. That freedom is actually a really important way of scaling decision making, and as long as that works, that's often the best, you know, option, the most free, the easiest to go along with. But of course, you know, when we're, again, the bigger things we're trying to do, the more we are going to have to coordinate with others. You know, the best software is not maintained by one person. As much freedom and complete control and decision making as that gives that one person, the software that is actually changing the world, and you know, outside of software, all the efforts, you know, ultimately involve more than one person. And so, how do you make decisions in groups? Some of the you know, things that we have to keep in mind while doing that is avoiding harassment online. This is just anyone looking at the internet at any point in human society so far. Is especially if you're a woman or otherwise marginalized, you're much more likely to face harassment. And this is something that's been frequently underlooked in our tools and in our processes. So I will circle back to how to try to deal with that in communication and decision making. So sticking on theme, there is a bit of similarity to the evolution of our projects and women's movement of the 70s. During the years in which the open source movement has been taking shape, a great emphasis has been placed on what are called leaderless, structuralist groups as the main, if not sole, organizational form of the movement. The source of this idea was a natural reaction against our overstructured corporations and universities, in which most of you know, the early founders of open source projects found ourselves, and the inevitable control this gave others over our lives, and the continual elitism of the left and similar groups among those who are supposedly fighting this structuredness, overstructuredness. You could place startups there. And this is word for word from an essay written in 1970, except that I'm replacing a few things about open source, but it was written about women's groups. The idea of openness, structuralistness, however, has moved from a healthy counter to those tendencies to become a goddess in its own right. The idea is as little examined as the term is much used, but has become an intrinsic and unquestioned part of open source philosophy. For the early development of the movement, this did not much matter. It early defined its main goal and its main method as writing working code and consciousness raising, and the structuralist open group was an excellent means to this end. The looseness and informality of it encouraged participation and discussion, and its often supportive atmosphere elicited personal insight. If nothing more concrete than personal itch scratching and insight ever resulted from these groups, that did not much matter because their purpose did not really extend beyond this. And that is Joe Freeman's classic essay called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And the basic takeaway is that as a group grows in size and importance and intent, like as your horizons get larger, for everyone to have the opportunity to be involved in a large group and to participate in its activities, the structure must be explicit, not implicit. So, yeah, these are small movement groups or in the open source free software movement, but surely in the outside world, we can have a much better approach already defined in how to do this. And so, world has been trying democracy for a while. I'm going to go back to some of the older ways as some of the solutions, but in the United States, the secret ballot was introduced en masse starting in 1890 and was universal by 1940. This was a secret ballot for people, individual people casting their votes. And before that, you had vote buying and intimidation. Paradoxically, it was possible to vote in secret when you were in Congress up until 1970. And James D'Angelo argues convincingly that part of the problem our politics faces right now, and they're, when you look at when people do sort of an academic study of people's policy preferences and what results we get out of our political process, the 99% has no influence whatsoever. It's the 1% that has almost full influence as far as their policy preferences on what happens. And of course, we're in a time where that's a life and death situation. If we simply were to coordinate, to agree that we aim the money printer at all of us in general, and not only at the rich, then we could safely stay home during this contagion without anyone going broke and risking their life for the fact that they need to work to live. But as our 1% capitalist class notices that people are getting paid more to stay home than to work at exploitive jobs, encourages people to not return to their jobs, there's a huge concern and belief that we need to, among the policies that we are going to see of clamping down on us. Sorry for that quick political aside, but coordination problem. Many people want the same thing, but how to agree on tactics. So James D'Angelo's analysis of Congress after 1970 is that what's happening there is once the secret ballot for Congress people was done, and this was done in the name of transparency. It's like, I voted for a congressperson, I should know who they voted for. Like, a local political boss should not know who I voted for, so my boss's vote is secret and not bought. But at least in the political machine era of U.S. politics, the people voting for the machine, like, of we get a sandwich out of the deal. Vote for the candidate they want, you get a sandwich, cool. Secret ballot helped get rid of that. But in Congress, where the idea is, oh, I should know what my congressperson is doing, the problem is my knowing what my congressperson is doing, and you and all of us, we have very little influence on what they're doing. And so powerful interests will always try and often succeed in controlling elected politicians, but at least prior to this 1970 Legislative Reorganization Act, the politician could lie to the people funding them and all that. And now they can't. So other analysis show that when a bill has a lot of media attention, like when lots of people are paying attention to it, then it starts to reflect the will of the people because there's enough people paying attention. But most of the time, It's just law after law after law that, you know, very few people are looking at, and those completely go the way that you know, the wealthiest interests want. And part of it's, you know, because when they pay for a congressperson, they know that that person's being faithful to their interests. Whereas prior to 1970, they might have been paying for it, but they couldn't be certain what they were getting. So this is a huge unintended consequence of transparency. But, you know, is the best that we can do is just going back to a system where, you know, a politician who we have very little influence over may or may not be looking out for interests just at chance. And so it's not a system that's exciting a lot of people. Voter participation in the US is low. They don't feel listened to. And, you know, this is a pretty weak reason for the importance of democratic governance, but it's still a big one for people having a feeling of influence, of being heard. And right now, our, you know, representative democracy isn't even giving people that. And so what can we do in our own projects and communities to do better? And so going back to the problem of politicians, it's not a new idea that those who seek power are precisely those who should not have it. This is, I think, a 1962 cartoon, but Walt Kelly was doing things on the same theme of people realizing that they should be choosing the person for president who is actively trying not to be president. And then the general idea, anyone who is capable of getting themselves made president should on no account be allowed to do the job. That's Douglas Adams' The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. Full quote, one of the major problems, for there are several, with governing people is that of whom you get to do it, or rather, who manages to get people to let them do it to them. It is well known that those people who most want to rule people are, ipso facto, those least suited to do it. To summarize the summary, anyone capable of getting themselves president should on no account be allowed to do the job. To summarize the summary of the summary, people are the problem. And as you know, clever as Walt Kelly, Douglas Adams, and other commentators of that ilk are, they weren't the first to think of this. Ancient Greeks actually thought of this problem and acted on it. And aspect of Athenian democracy was sortition, which is rule by those randomly selected, to put it in more computer science terms. But in the technology of most of the human history, it's lotocracy, rule by random lot, rule by people who are chosen, not because they were fighting for the job, not because most people elected them, but because a small number of people, because they were one of the people selected a large number to be the small number to do this work. And this approach gets around a lot of the problems that we just covered. It removes a lot of the issues of corruption, because, you know, to successfully do the corruption, which, you know, is happening, you know, right now, it's like you know, campaign funding or however else you gain power in a representative democracy. There's a lot of time for, you know, essentially the moneyed landed interests, et cetera, to influence and, you know, try to co-opt the person or try to block them from getting there if they're too inimical to their interests. Whereas when you're drawing from the population as a whole, the whole population would have to be corrupt. And again, you know, if we're going to have people being bought off, let's please have it, all of us be bought off. But, you know, the idea of giving, you know, people drawn at random who have not sought office the, you know, time and resources to do the job has shown good results in trials and has worked in history. So the idea of rule by lot applied on the local level has got, again, the anti-corruption advantage. It tends to represent the population better instead of having just the majority being able to elect all of their own. It has some of the same advantages of proportional representation because it's basically a representative sample, and that gives all the advantages of true diversity, of having different perspectives at play. And I think that this can be a key part for decision making in open source free software communities also, that gets around a lot of our problems of us all being self-selected, and leading to us even codifying. So the few projects that are more democratic often have, for instance, LibreOffice has the document foundation, and they have it's very democratic, but it's limited to people who've contributed to the project in terms of at least it's not just technical. They cover a lot of different ways of contributing, but it's still it's not necessarily putting the people who are most affected first, like the people who actually use the software. So very few software projects find ways to empower users, the people using the software. And sortition is a way of doing that. None of us wants to be, trying to control everything that's going on in our lives. But if we can share that work, then we as a people can have significant influence over how a software project that's important to us is run, about how our electricity and internet come to our house, and any other aspect of society. Sortition is fair and that it's egalitarian and ensures people have equal chance, instead of cutting out people because other people are prejudiced against them, or they just have been conditioned to not have the confidence that someone who has been raised from birth to be a leader would have, and that it sort of breaks actually the power of organized groups, whether it's political parties or other things, to bring power directly to the people, and sort of fights factionalism just in its nature, which can be important to the health of communities and societies. So as developers, those of us who are, and anyone who is out there using software, we need to understand that our software cannot meet its full potential without the participation of those who will be using it. And so there's structures being proposed and put in place in a lot of cases by a movement calling itself platform cooperativism, but it has the basic idea that when there is anything, there's a platform that's mediating control of our life, whether it's Google, GoToMeeting, Facebook, whatever, that we should have a way of having control over it. And so this is just proposing that we own important platforms cooperatively. And with the sortition idea, I'm proposing ways that we can make that collective ownership more meaningful by ensuring that who is represented in the decision making is representative of the users and not sort of ruled by those who have the most time, money, energy. Well, my colleague Michelle Mickey Metz phrased it as personal power, your understanding of your own worth. But there's the negative side of that of entitlement. So I'm moving away from ruled by the entitled. But as far as like how can you take a software project and structure it so that it is responding to the needs of the people who use it in a legal way, as well as whatever other approaches you put, like as using a sortition process to bring in people to help make decisions to be the ones who guide the development process. You can develop a cooperative platform. And more broadly, networks and movements can put in democratic practices, and we as technologists are trying to offer that software to help people live better lives. And again, great software starts with a greater understanding of people's needs. And so before building anything or writing a line of code, we should have deeper discussions with those who will use it, and engaging with networks and movements that are trying to improve the world, which there are a huge number right now, is I think actually the first step to then potentially developing a community that can have democratic communication and decision-making structures in it, whether it's structured as a cooperative platform or foundation or anything else. So continuing the survey decision-making processes around the world. The Zapatista movement in Mexico has been forming caracoles for snail, has a sense of a spiral of levels going on in it, and so constructing power through networks of autonomous villages. And the idea is that communities choose their own local authorities and delegates who carry out their mandate at various levels, knowing that if they did not fulfill them, they can be immediately removed from their posts. And this is a real world analog to something that mostly exists in the digital world, but which is also an important and interesting approach to scaling decision making, which is liquid democracy. The idea that I don't want to make all the decisions about the privacy protections that are needed for this platform or the society or whatever, but I trust Kate Crockford of the ACLU in Boston to make good decisions there. So I delegate my decision-making power to them, and they can in turn say, like, there's actually someone else who's a better expert, and for the time being, I'm going to delegate everyone who's said that I can make decisions for them to this person. So you get to a small enough group that you can actually have deliberative democracy. You can have discussion and communication, and not just here's 5 options, vote on them. Like, you always need the process of actually hashing out what the options are. And that's, hard to do with 1,000, a million, or a few billion people. should have mentioned on the cooperative platforms that some of the ones who are running that way is social.coop, which is a Mastodon instance, which is where I said I had my @Melançon account. Co-op Cycle, a European Federation of Bike Delivery Co-ops, is a software, another software cooperative, where it is actually governed democratically by the constituent co-ops. Fairmondo, an online marketplace, is another cooperative platform. May First Movement Technology is, Internet Service Provider Plus, consider themselves movement first, but also provide a great deal of hosting resources. They are formally organized as cooperative. But none are using some of the more innovative liquid democracy, or what I'll get to, my ideas for using sort of a random draw by lot sortition process for just the communication aspect. So the side to having, the ability to delegate and recall sort of presupposes that there is a functioning communication ecosystem out there, so that you know how your delegate voted. And this has the same problems we're looking at, where if you do have power starting to be concentrated in a smaller number of sort of predictable sets of people, so people who are slowly growing in influence, there's more chance for those people to be co-opted or to burn out, or to have all of those things.
Benjamin, sorry to interrupt. I just want to remind you, we've got about five to 7 minutes remaining. Just want to make sure if we have time for questions.
Right. Thank you. Got it. Yeah. Sorry. Off by 10 error. All right. Moving on. So don't get anything else out of this. Try to side with the anarchists and socialists who are doing anti-fascist work over the fascists. That's the lesson of the Spanish Civil War. But Spanish Civil War, in the 3 years, 1936 to 1939, that the Republican side, which was the anarchists and socialists, had power in most of the country, developed really rich democracy with community councils and workplace councils and all that, and that's continued this sort of democracy in the middle of revolution that actually also happened in 1917, but was sort of crushed externally and internally in Russia, where had this other model. So there's liquid democracy, recallable delegates. There's a similar sort of model where you look at the math and you can be like, okay, what's a reasonable size for decision making? A group of 12? Okay, so this group of 12 discusses things. They can select one person who goes to the next group of 12 or 20, and that group can discuss things in a small group, and choose a delegate to make decisions at the next higher level. And in 8 or 9 levels, you have like the population of the planet, and it's all done in very human scale communication, and you have instantly recallable delegates. And that sort of approach of like building from the base up is also called council democracy, and it's been really only seen in like revolutionary context, and then crushed by less revolutionary influences, whether it's in the revolution or outside. But it's interesting to see it emerge in lots of places. And did want to mention Lumio is a cooperative that publishes a lot of things about cooperatives and has their own online decision-making tools. But the developers themselves, they know there are some groups using it for hundreds of people, but they they don't imagine how the software works, for more than 100 people. It's not what it's designed for. And so that's sort of what I was alluding to with any of these contexts, even when it's liquid democracy and you're, delegating, going up, or the council system, you're still presupposing a communications ecosystem where people can get the context of what's going on in the world, and the decisions that people are making on their behalf, even if they're directly recallable about them, they need to have some understanding. So my pitch for a community of any size is to use the random sample decision-making method, if for nothing else, for communication in the group. Like, how do you scale the communication, which is itself the baseline for communicating? It is the baseline for decision-making. Like, you need the communication first, have decision-making. And so in order to actually scale a group without any subset of it becoming a de facto ruling subset, because they control the decision, they control the communication, which in a large sense, this controls the decision making, whoever ends up in control, however the decisions end up being made. The idea of using, someone wants a message to go out to the whole group of 100,000 people, a sample of 100 people or whatever makes the decision, should this message go out to this huge group? And so you're sharing the work of making decisions about communication. It's very lightweight. It doesn't have to, and that undergirds, I think, any sort of mass democracy, even if you try to break it down into small groups. So I should also mention sociocracy, which I think is pretty compatible with a lot of these ideas and with open source free software projects. It recognizes, the principle that you shouldn't be forcing anybody to do anything. And I think that needs to be, the idea of democracy internally to the people doing the work, not being imposed on. But the idea of, it has some interesting ways for linking groups together so that you can distribute the decision making. And I will stop there and go to questions if there are any, and if someone can show me how to see a chat or something, or if someone can just read them out to me.
Sure. There's a questions. If people want to post questions, you just click on the question mark icon. We can also unmute all attendees. So if they want to ask a question or provide some feedback, they're willing to do so. Let me unmute everyone. All right, so you should have the ability to unmute yourself if you'd like to raise a question for Benjamin. All right, Benjamin, thank you so much for this presentation. This was really kind of eye-opening. It's a refreshing break from some of the more technical presentations we have. This hopefully will open everyone's eyes and get people talking.
Yeah, please do contact me with any thoughts, questions, and end with the quote, which is capturing a lot of what I was saying. You've come because your liberation is bound up with mine. Let us work together. Let's work with, not for. Bite off whatever little piece you can, like this rabbit. And notes and more are at agarc.co scaling community, and I'll be adding more from some additional stuff added to this version of the presentation. Sorry for starting late and being a little scattered. Thank you very much, CMS Philly. Thank you for hosting this.
No, our pleasure. Thanks for Thank you for presenting and taking the time to put this together for us. Just a reminder for attendees, if you haven't seen it already, in the general channel in our Slack space, there are some raffles that you can sign up for WordPress hosting and Drupal tutorials, some subscriptions that were generously provided by our sponsors, so be sure to check that out. This concludes the 11 a.m. Session. Our next session will be at 1 p.m. after a lunch break. We hope to see you back then. Thanks, Benjamin.
Ciao.